Hey everyone, this is Brano, and I thought I would do a commentary over the development of Heal to Death. So, I started this game after a game jam, and the first thing I was doing was just getting the basic mechanics right. What took me 2 days in a game jam took me about a month and a half to get this into a real system. So at the moment, I've just been making basic cast bars and party members. In addition, I then just started off with creating the enemies and then an instant heal. So just all the basic mechanics. This is where I added in heal over times, where you can kind of see in the party frame that things were getting healed. This is absorption effects. Then I've got channeled spells, so ones that you would continually cast over a couple of seconds. This is an AoE heal that I implemented. Once again, all of these are making them systematically so I can use them multiple times with various spells. This one's more Tranquil Rain, which persists throughout the game, so you can see the healing slightly on the top left. And this is Healing Mass, which heals for a lot more. This is Chain Heal, which currently no visual effects, but it works. I finally added heal numbers so you can actually see that, yeah, things are actually happening within the game. And I finally implemented mana, so there's actually a cost to the spells. And mana regeneration, so you would spend mana and you would regain mana over time. I added the 5-second rule, so if you don't use mana for 5 seconds, you gain mana at an increased rate, 8 times quicker. Added a out of range graphic here. I added some attack graphics for when the units were attacking. I also added specific attacks afterwards, so instead of ramming into each other and dealing damage, they would actually have abilities to use against each other. You can see that there are some ability icons now next to the party panels. Also added enemy health bars, as I just needed to add a couple of visual feedback items here. Added some spell panels to tell you what the spells actually do. And I also added debuffs here, so you can see that the tank to tank is rendered and is taking damage over time. I added some selection highlights because I felt it was a bit hard to work out which party members were selected. I also allowed you to select enemies and have their panels pop up there so you could see what was going on. They were also given a debuff panel so you could see what debuffs they had. This is my first version of the tank model. I was still doing all the 3D modeling myself. This is before I got an artist, and I replaced this eventually, but this was my first 3D model that I added. Afterwards, I added the Ranger, which would shoot arrows. And then I added the Mage. I used AI faces and then just free textures that I found online. Eventually these all got removed. I then added the Fighter as the final party member, but I still needed to add a model for the Healer, which is where I have it here. All of these models were replaced with an actual artist's work, and it made me learn that I never want to do art by myself. These are the skeleton models I added. These lasted throughout most of development until around the end. There are finally damage numbers against the targets. In addition, your healing spells now damage the enemies because I felt like it would be good for pacing the dungeon a bit better. It started off only doing half damage, but I later buffed it to 100%. This is where I added tab target. It still kind of works, but there are issues with it. The Mage's Flame Strike ability got a graphic here, and I gave Tranquil Rain and healing mass a visual effect. This is where I added party members being able to be down, so if they die there, something would actually happen. So at this point I'm wrapping up the first playable build, where I've got a bunch of different enemies. So I've just got the skeletons, which just do a standard attack, and then I've got the renders, which do a debuff. This is the final boss of the first demo. Eventually this turned into the final boss of the tutorial, with it heavily nerfed. This is where I added a chain graphic for the healing stream and chain heal. It was changed later. After a bit of time, I finally got procedurally generated dungeons to work. I hadn't worked with Procgen until that point, so it was cool learning how it all worked. And yeah, this is basically the dungeon format that's still used in the final game. I added a kind of cyan paddle to indicate what you're casting against. Afterwards, I added pathfinding. So I learned how to do pathfinding in this game as well. So instead of it moving directly to a location, it would actually try to work out what the correct path was. I started to implement levels and experience at this point, but it didn't do anything for the moment. It's just getting the mechanics in place. But shortly after, I added upgrades, and you could select spells and upgrades. This one's the triage upgrade, which I've nerfed a lot in the final build, but basically it makes Lesser heal an instant cast spell and gives it a cooldown with charges. So it's a very powerful upgrade. This is Reserved Pain, which basically when you cast Lesser Heal on a friendly ally, it will deal more damage. I added some enemy collisions for a period of time, but I removed them because it caused too many gameplay issues. This is the Acid Rain upgrade, which I've buffed a lot since, but basically it was just a cool spin on Tranquil Rain, where now it's a primary damaging ability in a healing game, which I felt was novel. I added animation blending, which means that when you were walking and stopped, it would blend into an idle state rather than immediately snap to it, which was a lot better. This is where I started to implement the ability to select your draft, as I wanted to get the intended game mode that I was thinking of in my head into the game. This went through a lot of iterations. The specific game mode. This was me adding the map system where you'll be guided to the exit. I also updated the graphical element for Circle of Healing at this point. I originally had these Crypt Guardians spawn and kill you after you ran out of time. They were removed because running out of time really stressed people out, and I just decided, I'd rather just be generous. Eventually, though, just even simply having the timer was too much. I added a new enemy, the Toxic Skeleton, which would shoot a poison bolt at a random target. And this is the first spell I'd added in a while, Rising Sun. It instantly heals the target for a moderate amount and adds a heal over time effect on there as well. We've got Chain Heal, the new Chain Heal graphic. It looks pretty similar to what's in there today, but I improved it a little bit further in development. Finally added an options menu to do various things within the game. From here I added a couple new party members, the Crusader and the Berserker, and here I added a Steam page. Maybe a little bit too early, but oh well, it's good to get it up. Added the ability to move stuff on your hotbar, as well as giving you a spell book just to see what you've selected here. I added icons for various resistances. These were all merged into a single stat later in development. This is where I added a potion and coins now that you could basically get and buy stuff from the shop. This was later changed to soul fragments. This is me adding the armor panel, which is me just setting up so that you can give your party members gear, and this is where it finally ends. You can see how many stats there used to be. All of them just resistances. It didn't really work, so that was eventually removed. This is the objective system. I was going to expand on this a lot more, but I eventually decided that it was better to just use it for the tutorial and just have a basic gameplay loop. That was the earliest sign of the level selection, and I quickly turned it into an overworld, but once again it's just a plane where, look, it's there, it's functional, it doesn't look good or anything like that. This is me adding the bare bones basics for the town. At the moment I've just got the inn modeled. This is a new spell, Flash Heal. It's a quick mana inefficient heal that heals for a lot. And Stimulating Burst, which will consume a heal over time effect to heal for the full amount of that effect. Added some highlights, which is just a quality of life feature. And then I finally simplified the stats, putting everything into one magic resistance stat. Here's the map, and you can see that the dungeon used to be huge. I made the map discoverable, so there's kind of a fog of war going on here. This was all eventually turned into just a mini-map. Added a couple more buildings into the town, though they weren't really functional yet. This is where I added loading screens just to make it a little less jolty. Though you can still kind of see a bit of a jolt there. You can now select the buildings to go in them, and this was just me setting up things so that the permanent upgrade system could work. Added some furniture to the inn, and you can see some of the progression of the user interface to select upgrades. So this is where you would be able to select from more party members. I started to do a UI visual improvement because I had been told that my UI was terrible, and I tried to fix it myself. So you can probably see it's still pretty similar to today, but I'm not happy with how it went. I wish I had more time. I wish my artist had more time to be able to improve it. Added a boot spin there and a victory circle just as more visual elements for the game. Added the ability for the textures to change mid-combat. Well, mid-run. And, oh yeah, in here I started to shrink the dungeon to a much smaller dungeon. Because it was too big and I was redefining kind of how I wanted my game to be. I was experimenting a lot with what was the best gameplay loop, what made the best gameplay loop, what were the types of what made the game the most fun. Alright, here I added some church furniture, and I also added a secret area right here, which basically, if you find a oddity within the wall, you may be able to have a surprise. I added party formation because a lot of people asked for it. It's not really needed, but a lot of people asked for it, and it's just like, okay, cool, I'll give it to you in case you want it. Added some more enemies here, as well as setting up the UI to be able to buy new spells. So here you can buy a new spell. At this point I only had 13 spells in the game. This is a new spell for Phoenix Ashes, which will heal the target instantly for your maximum HP. And Life Transfer, which will transfer your life to your target. This is an upgrade that turns the heal into a shield. And some NPC spells like the Warlock's Death Bolt that will damage the Warlock but deal a lot of damage to the target. And there's Pyroblast, which if it crits, it will explode, doing a Flame Spike ability. Here's Holy Light, which is kind of like a medium heal spell. I later gave it an identity by giving it a crit modifier. Here's Light's Hammer, which will basically be a melee damage AoE heal, which is kind of cool. Here's a healing power upgrade for you to update, and some camera transitions. New NPC spells that I added here. And I added the ability to finally reset your save file, so you didn't have to actually delete it if you wanted to play from the start again. I added a cloud shader and some loading bars. This spell is Mark of Reaping, where it basically just means your damaging spells now heal a particular target. Nurture, which heals more based on the amount of hots on a target. Clear Casting, which is a buff that reduces the mana cost of your next 5 spells. Surgical Precision, which just gives you a 100% crit chance on your next spell. Fighting Spirit, which is a hot that heals more based on how low the target is on the initial cast. Healing Aura, which will just passively heal things nearby. These enemies will drop poison pools upon death. So that was just a cool new mechanic I made. I've decided to shrink the dungeon again after I sort of finally found, through experimentation, exactly what I wanted the game mode to be. So I made it small, and I felt that smaller dungeons with bosses in between was going to be the most fun shortly after that experiment. These are skeleton healers who will heal, so it's just a cool new mechanic. This is the first boss I've made in a while, the Frost Tyrant boss, which will kind of have these skeletons and try to undo blazes, which you gotta keep alight, otherwise it will do a big AoE damage spell. Darkmend is a really mana efficient heal that leaves a nasty dot on your target. Here's a new enemy for the Skeleton Torturer, which, yeah, it just does an AoE damage spell. Added a bunch more party member spells at this point, just to add more variety. Added party member upgrades at the barracks, and this is a area that I threw out called Choose Your Path. Basically, you would choose a path, kind of like in Binding of Isaac, or I forget which game. Anyway, or Slay the Spy specifically, and yeah, it just didn't work out. Here are new spells. There's Mass Dispel, which just dispels everything, and Soothing Mist, which is it's like a 0 mana cost heal over time. Blooming Life will explode for a lot of healing when it expires. It's a kind of a cool hot. And this was their Syncretic Rise, which heals both you and the target. Added a couple more bosses, which have all made it to the final game with significant adjustments to what they do and their visual effects and the room. So some of them you'll probably notice if you play the game that this is where they came from during this phase of development. I finally removed the Crypt Guardians and added Creeping Shadows, which just ports you to the boss room, as I felt, timers were just stressing out people too much. This is the Dark Master boss, which teleports you into a room. The Lich Mages, which the boss fight revolves around there being a remembrance game, and I made it a lot more forgiving. The Winterstorm Warden will cast the Spiraling Rain spirals, which you kind of have to dodge. I made it a lot more visually obvious throughout development. The Icemancer of the Damned boss. Alright, at this point I added a bloom effect for the Blooming Life spell. This is where I added animation effects for like when you cast spells. You can see that based on the spell that's cast, a different visual effect is in play. This is where I started to test out the environment files just to give off different visual effects. So I'm just experimenting, and at this point I added epic upgrades. So if you chose an epic upgrade, it would change the icons of the spells, which I thought was cool. This is where I began to start to revamp the boss rooms, giving them more of a personal flair. And an entrance just to show, hey, this is where you originally came from. Since a bunch of people were getting confused and lost. This is a new spell called Earthquake. And I started to make a couple of UI adjustments at this point. So this was my third attempt at redoing the user interface, and this is very close to what you've got in the current game. I replaced some of the poison patch graphics with fire patch graphics, which is a lot nicer. Finally got new models for some of my characters, so I started to so I basically replaced all the old ones with the new ones at this point. Started to do a lot of decoration and 3D modeling around September, so you can see there's a bunch of new models for the various zones in this game. Added numbers that would show healing as well. I added some flags to help identify when your party members were in a passive state. This is where I finally started to look at making the overworld a bit more interesting. And I got pretty close to finalizing what I wanted the lighting environmental effects to look like. Now, at this point I was mostly focused on visual improvements, so this is where I started to add a lot more of the visual spell effects, and this is pretty close to what they ended up being. So there's 5 of them, but I'm just going to show you what all of them look like at the time. So you got Darkman, the spell, instant heal, Rising Sun, which creates a sun effect, which is kind of cool. Stimulating Burst, of course, bursts the healing over time effect. Noche has a really cool effect where it spawns out a bunch of maple leaves, which eventually kind of disintegrate. There's Resurrection. It's pretty nice. And you'll see the new bloom effect kind of explodes a bit, which is really cool. Once again, I just added a bunch of unique effects to every single spell to make sure that if you kind of knew what the game was, you could know exactly what the player was using. At this point, I was getting pretty close to finishing the overworld. I was adding some lighting effects to it, and it was beginning to look pretty good. I redid parts of the Arcane Magistrate's room, and now it's pretty close to what you see in the final game. I started to add enemies for the Battlegrave area, and I added a graphic that would signify which target you wanted your party members to attack. At that point, I also started to do a lot more drip feeding in the tutorial. So here are some of the final enemies for the final zone that I added. So I was getting pretty close to being content complete by this point. This is the first boss for the final area, the Death Knight Champion. He spawns a bunch of void zones, which you kind of have to avoid in a maze-like fashion. This is Lord of Affliction, which basically you gotta pick your poison and just see what the least bad effect is to go with. Added a background to the town to make it feel like it's a real place. And here are some of the visual elements for the Necromancer's Lair. I finally finished up the overworld. The church is very much inspired by Diablo 1. So this is the final zone, which is really cool. Added some particle effects for when you unlock something. There was originally some sparkle effects for completing a new zone, but it just didn't look good, so I removed it. I added a animation for when you bought stuff from the shop, so it felt impactful. Here are some new spells, and Power basically just increases the damage your allies do, and Holy Barrier is a free absorption effect. Added new icons for all of the rare and epic items that you could equip, and I added 3D models for them as well. You can see the Crusader helm there, which is kind of cool, as well as the Wizard's hat. This is a quality of life thing where I added cannot use labels if you cannot use the item. People were saying that crits weren't obvious enough, so I added a yellow outline to them. And at this point I got the Fighter and Corsair models, which you can see in the second and third slot. Added a cutscene, which I then hired someone to do voice acting for, and I think this will give people a lot more information as to what this game is about. I got new skeleton models to finally replace the old ones, so the enemies were looking good. I added some larger passive flags because no one was working out that a lot of people were forgetting that their party members were in passive mode. There's more visual effects for the party members. Here's the cleric model, which looks really nice. And I added a low on matter visual shader, which basically just makes it very clear when you're running low on mana. And I finally, at this point, got all the models for the game, which was really nice for like your party members. We still need to add a couple more enemies. I added the hand particle effects to your party members, and I added a time limit option after a lot of feedback of people just saying, I can't stand the timer. This was moved to area, which was another request. I added some ghoul enemies, some ghost enemies, and eventually some more ghoul enemies. There's also some more ghost enemies, which I didn't capture. And here are some frost particles for specifically the ice zone. Anyway, that is the development of Heal to Death. It is going to be available on the 8th of April 2025, so wishlist it if you're interested. I hope you enjoyed the entirety of the development of Heal to Death.